I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight I'm peering through an iron gate that's never really closed, not to you at least. The same gate that kept peasants out, kept secrets in, and behind its heavy beams and rusted hinges, the story of untouchable power begins to creak open. Step closer. Feel the damp mist curling around the wooden posts. Hear the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer inside the courtyard. Taste the stale smoke drifting from a distant hearth. Why build a gate so tall no villager could see over it? Why hinge it with iron thick enough to stop an army that never came? Who was it really built to keep safe, and from whom? If this kind of secret passage through time soothes your restless thoughts, tap that like and subscribe. I promise to rattle the old gates again and again, quietly, of course. Sometimes I wonder who's half awake out there, imagining their own hidden gate. If that's you, drop a whisper below. Now take a breath, rest your head back, and drift with me through these gates deeper into a manner few dared question. The gate creaks wider as you pass under its shadow. You tread slowly over damp stones, your footsteps muffled by moss and centuries of whispered caution. Inside the manor's courtyard yawns open a patchwork of muddy tracks, tethered horses, and barrels stacked high against gray walls. Here, the gate was more than timber and iron. It was a promise, a warning, a line peasants would never cross without trembling. One fact remains: medieval lords spent fortunes fortifying these gates, not just against invaders from afar, but against their own tenants below. Some scholars still puzzle over how often these gates faced real sieges versus how much they symbolized fear, fear of revolt, fear of betrayal, fear that power was far more fragile than it looked from a stone tower. You step closer to a guardhouse tucked against the gate's inner wall. A sleepy guard in patched leather jerkin leans on his spear, half dozing, half listening, for trouble that rarely arrives. It's not the iron that keeps him loyal, it's the knowledge that behind him the Lord's favor decides who eats well and who eats stale bread dipped in brine. A stray rooster pecks at frozen straw, oblivious to the gate's majesty. The irony is that while stone and iron kept peasants out, gossip always found its way in, over walls, under doors, whispered by the same guards meant to stand watch. There's no scholarly consensus on how much these gossip channels shape the politics behind the gate, but one careless word could open the way for rebellion as surely as a battering ram. The gate's beams groan in the wind. You trace the iron bands hammered in zigzag patterns meant to strengthen the wood against siege fire. But when no armies came, when winters were long and quiet, these gates mostly guarded feasts from hungry eyes, gold from greedy hands, and secrets from tongues eager to wag. Sometimes you wonder who swung these gates open for the last time: a loyal steward, a bribed blacksmith, or perhaps they simply rotted from within, like power that forgets it's only wood and iron in the end. You wander beneath the arch once more, feeling its chill settle on your shoulders. Somewhere deeper inside the manor's true heart waits its lord, perched in a high hall, surrounded by loyal knights, scheming stewards, and peasants who never truly left, even when barred by the thickest gates. But for now, stand here in the threshold. Listen to the hinges sigh. Beyond this point, power shifts from walls to men in armor, from gates to swords, from fear to the rituals that bind nights at dawn. At first light, when the mist still clings to damp stone, you hear them before you see them: iron boots striking frost-bitten ground, the low thud of hooves, the quiet rattle of chainmail brushing leather. Nights at dawn were not just symbols of chivalry. They were living armored reminders that the Lord's word could be carried on horseback enforced at sword point and sung about in fearful whispers from hearth to hearth. You stand at the edge of the manor's training yard as the knights gather in a loose half circle. Their helmets are tucked under arms, breath steaming in the chill eyes, darting to the Lord's steward, who calls roll in a voice sharp as the frost. One by one, they slap mailed fists to breastplates, muttering oaths that echo off stone. You'd think loyalty is earned through coin or conquest, but here it's built at dawn, ritual by ritual, so even the sleepy forget how to rebel. It's a fact that medieval lords did not keep knights merely for battles abroad. Many never marched far at all. These armored men were insurance against peasants who might steal a pig neighbor's, who might covet a plot of wheat, or rival lords who might sniff out weakness like wolves at a fence. Scholars still argue how many of these knights were truly trained killers versus ceremonial muscle parading their colors, but rarely drawing real blood. A black mare stamps at the yard's edge, its breath a pale plume against the dim sky. A squire struggles with a tangled stirrup cheeks, red with cold and embarrassment. Nearby, an older knight, his beard-frosted nose crooked from an old lance blow, rests a gauntlet on the boy's shoulder. No scolding, just a grunt and a nod. The squire gets the message. Loyalty is taught at sunrise with cold hands and quiet correction. As the sun breaks through thin clouds, a horn sounds from the manor's tallest turret. The knights fall silent. This is more than morning drill. It's theater. Each clang of sword on shield tells the village beyond the walls, stay humble, stay bound. Inside the yard, the sound comforts the lord watching from his window, wrapped in fur, sipping warm ale, while armored men promise his safety with every synchronized strike. You notice the subtle hierarchy here. New knights stand at the fringes, their armor dull and dented. Veterans near the center wear gleaming plate-bright surcoats stitched with faded heraldry. Some still bear scars beneath the steel reminders that loyalty sometimes bleeds. Yet beneath all this iron, a softer bond hums, shared bread, late-night whispers, by the barracks hearth, drunken confessions after tournaments that ended with more bruises than trophies. The steward finishes his roll call and steps aside as the Lord himself appears at the high stair. He does not speak. He only lifts one gloved hand. In perfect unison, the knights kneel their breath, mixing with the early fog, like incense rising to a stone god. The moment is quick, silent, absolute. Then the hand drops, steel scrapes, horses snort. The dawn ritual ends. It's worth noting that historians still puzzle over how often this display was more show than substance. Did every dawn drill truly scare restless peasants back to their plows? Or did the real power lie in the whispered tales that filtered down to alehouses, stories of knights who could split a man like firewood if ordered? You step back as the formation breaks. Some knights mount and ride out to patrol borders they know by heart. Others drift toward the stables, to mend tack or gossip over warm mash for the horses. One younger knight catches your eye, his gaze restless under a dented visor, already dreaming of tournaments. Ransom, perhaps rebellion, if fortune shifts. The clang of iron fades as dawn brightens into day. But you know the real work of fear has been done. The peasants will hear the echoing hooves, and remember the gate might close at dusk. But at dawn, the knights rise, ironclad shadows at the Lord's side. In the soft hush that follows the night's thunder, your footsteps drift away from polished steel and settle into the earth, damp, uneven, furrowed by centuries of toil. Here in the fields, stretching beyond the manor's walls, power feels different. No iron gates or armored oaths, just bent backs, cold fingers, and a quiet rebellion that sprouts between rows of rye. You stand beside a low stone fence where the morning frost clings to thorny hedges. Ahead, peasant serfs, legally bound to the land, move like shadows through furrows of half-frozen soil. Woolen tunics, patched with old scraps, hang heavy with dew. A crooked wooden plow drags a muddy line pulled by an ox, whose ribs show more devotion than any oath spoken at dawn. It's a fact that most medieval lords depended on these peasants far more than they'd ever admit from the high table. No taxes of coin or parchment seals could rival the wealth plowed up by hands and hooves every season. Some scholars still debate whether the system was truly stable or one harvest failure away from collapse, a fragile bargain between fear and the hunger that made men keep digging. You follow a woman with a wicker basket strapped to her hip, trailing behind two barefoot boys who scatter seeds with red cracked fingers. The basket rattles with dry grains, payment for a future they may never taste. Now and then, the woman glances at the manor on the hill, its gates half shut against her gaze, as if daring her to dream beyond her small strip of earth. A sudden shout drifts over the field. An old man, in a rough cap, curses at a stubborn mule, waving a stick more for show than pain. The mule doesn't flinch. It knows the rhythm better than the man himself. In this quiet rebellion, even animals play their part. They work when they want stall, when they can graze on the Lord's hay, when no steward's eye is sharp enough to catch them. There's an old, half-joking truth, whispered from plow to hearth. If you want to outwit a lord, you hide your strength in plain sight. Surviving records offer conflicting hints about how peasants stretched thin rations, concealed secret patches of barley, or slipped off in the night to hunt rabbits, where only the Lord was meant to hunt deer. Small acts, petty thefts, unrecorded bushels, a hidden hen added up to quiet defiance that no iron gate could keep out. A dog barks from a hut at the field's edge, one of many huts scattered like fallen dominoes. Roofs thatched so poorly the wind whistles through the rushes at night. Inside a pot of thin cabbage stew, bubbles over a low fire, the scent fighting the cold that creeps through splintered doors. You pause at the threshold unseen, watching a grandmother mend a tunic by flickering flame, humming a song older than the manor itself. Every evening, the peasants gather at these fires to share rumors, a steward's affair, a night's lost duel, a missing sack of grain that mysteriously reappears behind the miller's shed. Some talk of leaving running to distant towns where a lord's seal holds less sway. Others know better. The road is watched, the forests patrolled, and the gates close tight when rumors reach the manor's ears. Still, the rebellion flickers on soft as candlelight, stubborn as weeds in a fallow field. Tomorrow, they'll bow their heads when the steward counts heads and measures grain. But tonight someone might slip a stolen egg into a neighbor's pot or hide an extra rabbit beneath a basket of turnips. The land gives. The land takes. And the peasants bend just enough to keep living another season under the watchful eyes on the hill. You stand once more at the fence, the sky above turning to pale silver as the sun climbs higher. Beyond the furrows, the manor's iron gate gleams in the distance, a symbol of untouchable power. But here, in the muddy fields, power leaks through every furrow carried on calloused palms, and whispered jokes the Lord will never hear. If you stand very still beside the village henhouse, you'll hear the true heartbeat of feudal wealth, and it clucks. Taxes paid in chickens, eggs, jars of honey, sacks of barley, all tumbling through thatched roofs and scratching in straw before they ever reached a lord's coffer. A single coin might never jingle in a peasant's pocket, yet the manor's pantry stayed full, one feathered tribute at a time. You wander into the yard behind a crooked cottage where a boy, about 8, is coaxing a speckled hen into a wicker crate. The hen seems unimpressed by her sudden promotion to tax payment, flapping and clucking in protest, while the boy mutters half-formed curses he surely learned from older mouths by the hearth. His mother stands nearby, arms folded, watching the sun slip higher each tick of daylight, a reminder that the steward will soon pass through ledger in hand, eyes sharp for unpaid dues. It's a curious fact that throughout medieval Europe, taxes were rarely neat piles of silver. Livestock ale bushels of wheat, wheels of cheese, anything a lord could eat, sell, or hoard behind stone walls. Some scholars still argue about how much these so-called in-kind taxes truly fed the manor, or whether they mostly greased the wheels of favoritism, hens traded for forgiveness. Honey slipped to the steward to overlook a poached rabbit or two. A rooster crows from the fence post as you move along the lane. Outside, each low door, tribute gathers in small, scruffy piles, baskets of eggs padded with straw clay pots of clotted cream, sealed with wax, a squealing piglet, bound with rough twine. A girl guards a row of jars filled with dark, sticky honey. She waves off a curious dog. With the authority of a queen, her family's taxes depend on keeping those jars safe from hungry snouts. A breeze carries the sour-sweet smell of livestock through the village. Somewhere, a baby wails. Somewhere else, a group of old women cackle over who's behind on dues this year, rumor sharper than any sword. Peasants knew exactly how to weigh the risk of withholding a chicken, here an egg there. If the steward caught wind of a missing hen, the punishment might be harsh. A fine twice the worth, or worse, a public shaming that left a family with fewer scraps than before. Yet hidden under this barter of feathers and milk jars is a quiet truth. The Lord's wealth was no simple chest of gold. It was alive, scratching in coops, grazing on village commons, buzzing in hives, hidden deep in the forest. Each tax day, the manor gates swung wide to swallow it all, a living parade of tribute that the peasants raised, fed, and surrendered because the law said they must. You pass under the manor gate again, in your mind, following the trail of squawking hens and bristling piglets as they're marched into the inner courtyard. A steward, plump with the perks of unpaid bribes, counts each creature with bored precision, chalking tallies on a slate board. A single missing egg means suspicion. A missing goat means a knock at the door at dusk. Fear keeps the flow steady. But so does pride. Nobody wants to be the fool who comes up short when the manor's kitchen expects its feast. There's no clear agreement among historians on whether these odd taxes kept peasants loyal through survival or crushed them under a quiet pecking burden. Some records speak of families trading extra eggs to earn a steward's blind eye or sneaking a fat goose out the back before it waddled up to the manor steps. A single whispered bribe might change a winter's fate. No coins exchanged, only a hen that found its way into a steward's cooking pot. As you wander past the last fence, the boy with the crate lifts it high, the hen inside finally resigned to her royal fate as tax payment. The mother calls him in with a clap of her hands. Tonight, the Lord's hearth will sizzle with fresh poultry. Tomorrow, the village will wake early, cluck their tongues at the gossip, and count their feathers once more, each one a tiny debt, a small rebellion, a hope that next year, maybe the steward forgets to knock. Step through the manor's main hall, and you'll find warmth that flickers like an open secret, roaring fire slabs of meat so heavy they bend the boards of oak tables, Flagons of ale poured faster than any steward can tally. Here, the Lord's power isn't just sealed in stone or stitched into a knight's surcoat. It's roasted, spitted, salted, and served until even the hungriest rumor dies beneath the clatter of bones and laughter. A hush falls when you first enter. Servants scurry like shadows between benches, their arms loaded with trenchers piled high with bread and dripping joints of venison. A mastiff lounges near the hearth, eyes half shut, belly round, with scraps too fine for a peasant's plate. Overhead, blackened beams drip with the smell of fat and smoke, a scent that seeps into clothes, hair, even dreams. One undeniable fact: these feasts weren't just indulgence, they were performance. Every goblet of spiced wine was a reminder that the Lord's storerooms were full, while fields outside scraped by on watery porridge. Some scholars argue that a manor's true strength was measured not by the thickness of its walls, but by how many deer roasted on its spits each winter. You pause near the head table. The Lord reclines on a carved chair, draped in fur-lined velvet rings, flashing in the candlelight. He raises a silver cup, nodding lazily to musicians who pluck out tunes that drown the whispers beneath. A steward leans in now, and then murmuring the day's gossip in the Lord's ear, reminding him who owes taxes and chickens, who might be late on wheat, whose daughter might secure an alliance worth toasting over tonight's boar. Closer to the hearth, peasants lucky enough to serve watch scraps tumble from the high-board bones. They'll pocket bits, they'll sneak home beneath aprons. A soft rebellion of hunger and cunning that no iron gate can fully bar. The feast hums on. Jesters tumble near the rushes, dogs snap at stray bones, and somewhere a hidden poet commits every boast and drunken vow to memory. Tomorrow, the gossip will flutter through the village. Who overate? Who overdrank? Whose gluttony cracked the mask of power for one careless hour? And yet the hall's warmth is a reminder: cold fields or not, the Lord feasts. And as long as his table groans under the weight of meat and mead, his rule stands untouched. Slip out of the hall, warmth fading from your skin as stone walls tighten around you. Just beyond the great fire's glow, power takes a colder shape. No feast, no jesters, only the echo of boots on cobblestone and the hush of a gathering crowd beneath a gray sky. Here in the courtyard, the Lord's word becomes law in its rawest form. Private justice spoken beneath a tattered banner. No parchment needed, no appeal allowed. A hush drapes the gathered peasants like a damp cloak. They stand in ragged rows, wives clutching shawls, tighter children peeking through elbows, a crooked old man leaning on a twisted stick. At the center, a wooden stool sits empty on a raised platform. Beside it, the steward reads out a charged voice, flat eyes flicking from paper, to the accused, who stands trembling at the platform's base. One known fact: manor justice was swift, brutal, and final. A lord could settle a stolen loaf, a boundary dispute, or a blood debt without consulting any royal court. Some scholars still puzzle over how often these judgments served fairness versus feeding the Lord's hunger for control. Surviving records tell of punishments that drifted from simple fines to an exile's cold road, or the block if the mood turned dark. A woman sobs into her shawl. The accused, a young tenant boots muddy from fields, keeps his gaze low. His crime: a missing chicken, a rumor of fence breaking, perhaps just bad luck at harvest. You can almost taste the tension hanging over the stones like iron frost. A lord seated above, swaddled in fur, his gloved finger tapping the armrest as the steward drones on. When the sentence comes, it's spoken softly, a blade hidden in silk, a fine a day in the stocks, or sometimes a command that vanishes a man from the village path forever. No gavel, no jury, just a nod from the dais, a ripple through the crowd, and the knowledge that here justice wears the Lord's face alone. Nearby, a pair of boys peer over the wall eyes, wide with curiosity. Tomorrow they'll whisper every detail by the hearth, their parents shushing them with sharp looks, but listening all the same. It's how power roots itself. Fear retold punishment. Imagine the silent reminder that the iron gate isn't the only barrier. The courtyard stones remember every judgment spoken here, each echo drifting down muddy roads to keep the plowmen humble. The Lord stands, cloak swirling behind him. His steward follows close, clutching the sealed scroll that will tuck this small trial into a ledger no peasant will ever read. You step back as the crowd melts away, mothers tugging children by the wrist, old men muttering curses too low for any steward's ear, and in that emptiness, you feel it, the hush of a courtyard that has seen 1,000 whispered verdicts and will cradle 1,000 more. Step away from the cold stone courtyard and follow the torch-lit passage deeper into the manor, where shadows twist behind thick curtains and alliances are sealed with more than parchment. Here, at the edge of a flickering hearth, you glimpse the hidden machinery that kept a feudal lord untouchable marriages arranged by candlelight oaths, whispered in blood secrets, traded for power that could outlast any rebellion outside the gate. A hush hangs over a chamber draped in faded tapestries, stags mid-leap, hawks frozen mid-dive threads, unraveling where damp has crept through the old stone. 2 men sit at a heavy table. Between them, a goblet of spiced wine and a narrow blade, its tip catching the glow of the single candle. No audience, no grand feast, just the soft scrape of rings against wood as they clasp wrists in the fire's sighing light. It's a plain fact that feudal alliances ran deeper than signed scrolls. Blood-sealed promises where ink might wash away in the next storm. Some scholars still argue how many of these blood oaths were real, and how many were crafted later into legend to frighten rivals into submission. But here, at this quiet table, the blade makes its promise simple betray this pact, and you might find a sharper edge waiting before dawn. A door creaks. A young woman steps in her gown, simple yet marked by the thread of gold trim that betrays her worth. She glances at the men eyes, flicking to the blade, then to the goblet. An arranged match, a bond that ties 2 rival manors together, like stitches over a wound no one trusts to heal on its own. She knows she's more contract than bride, her dowry a bridge across the moat of suspicion. A servant hovers by the hearth, pretending not to listen, as the men murmur, promises shared, hunting rights, mutual aid if a rival lord tests the borders, a quiet understanding that when famine hits one, granary will feed 2 halls. The woman listens too silent, witness to how easily bloodlines turn into bargaining chips, how a child in her belly could mean the difference between war and uneasy peace. There's no grand celebration tonight, no knights clinking goblets or peasants whispering about lavish feasts. Just a hush, a signature pricked into skin, and the distant howl of wind battering shuttered windows. Outside, peasants bend over flickering candles, clueless that their plows and fields might soon serve a new master if this pact holds. Historians still debate whether these secret pacts kept peace or stoked bloodshed later when heirs squabbled over scraps of land. But one truth lingers in this chamber. Behind every iron gate, an armored knight was a quiet room like this, where men bled a few drops to avoid bleeding more on the muddy roads beyond. The candle gutters low, The goblet is drained, and the blade is wiped clean on a silk sleeve. Somewhere in the darkness, a wedding is planned. For spring, a new bond forged to keep the Lord's power stitched tight, one secret oath at a time. Step back out into the cold night air and tilt your gaze upward. There it is rising above the fields, like a stone crown, the castle on the hill. While peasants huddle in thatched cottages below, and knights clink goblets in smoky halls, the Lord's real shield stands silent and unyielding, its spiral staircases curling upward, like ribs around a heart that never stops guarding itself. You follow the worn path that twists up the slope boots, scuffing frostbitten grass, where generations of messengers, tax collectors, and trembling petitioners have trudged before you. Each step brings you closer to the fortress walls, thick, rough blocks mortared by hands that were never paid in coin, only in permission to live a few miles closer to the gates they'd never pass through again. A simple truth castles were more than just homes. They were messages carved into the skyline. Some scholars still argue whether their high towers truly repelled armies or mostly discouraged poor farmers from dreaming too loudly about revenge. After all, it's hard to imagine rebellion when you have to look uphill at walls that turn arrows aside and echo the clink of iron-shod boots. Near the base of the wall, a guard scratches his chin beneath a steel cap, squinting at the road, snaking down to the village. He's not expecting an invasion. His watchful eyes are mostly turned inward, guarding against the sudden rumor, the stray thief, the desperate tenant who might try to scale the walls when famine claws too close. You find a narrow door, half hidden beneath a jut of crumbling masonry. Duck through, and you're swallowed by stone spiral stairs, winding like a snake's spine, each step worn smooth by boots that carried news of births, deaths, betrayals. The air smells of damp and cold iron. Your fingers brush the rough wall for balance. It's said the spiral staircases were built clockwise so that defenders coming down could swing swords freely with their right hands, forcing attackers to fight awkwardly uphill. There's no scholarly consensus if this clever trick ever saved a lord's life, but the story lives on, winding upward like the stairs themselves. A torch flickers on a landing, casting shadows that breathe across ancient tapestries. Here a faded stag hunts forever through embroidered brambles. There a lion glares through moth-eaten threads, its stitched mane catching sparks of firelight as you climb higher. At the top, the wind catches you cold, clean, merciless. From this perch, you see it all the fields like patchwork below the specks of villagers trudging home the manor's gate, the narrow road twisting out toward rival lands. If walls fail, this height remains. If knights fall, these stones stand. And inside these stones, the Lord's secrets are tucked behind iron-banded doors, scrolls sealed in wax oaths whispered behind high windows. Far below the village, smoke curls into dusk. Up here, the stone walls hum, with an old promise: the higher the tower, the farther a lord's power can reach, until even the stars feel like they belong behind these battlements. Step down from the battlements and drift into the tangled woods beyond the manor's reach, where the trees belong to the Lord as surely as the peasants do, though the branches care nothing for seals or swords. Here, beneath ancient oaks and thorny underbrush, a different sort of boundary whispers through every rustle of leaves the Lord's right to hunt the peasant's fear, to trespass, and the punishment that could fall as swift as an arrow. You push through brambles damp with morning dew, your boots muffled by fallen leaves. Ahead, a pair of rough paths wind through the undergrowth, one well trodden by the Lord's huntsman, the other hidden beaten flat, only by desperate feet slipping through before dawn. Somewhere close, a startled deer bounds away its hooves, drumming a warning through the hush. One solid fact in many parts of medieval Europe, hunting rights were jealously guarded. Deer boar, even the smallest rabbits, could mean fresh meat for a starving family if they dared risk the Lord's wrath. Historians still debate how strictly these laws were enforced day to day, but surviving records whisper of harsh penalties. A poacher caught with venison could lose more than his bow, sometimes his hand, sometimes his life. You find signs of both worlds here. A noble's boot print, crisp and deep, where a mounted hunter paused to peer through the mist. Nearby, a snare half hidden beneath a fern left by some brave peasant or hungry child, hoping the wood's silence would hide what the manner forbids. The irony is sharp. While the Lord's table groans with roasted stag and wild fowl, the very peasants who pay him in chickens might die for snaring a rabbit that strayed too close to their doorstep. In a small clearing, the Lord's hunting party gathers at dawn's edge. Dogs yelp and strain against leather leads, noses quivering at scents the human nose cannot follow. A huntsman in a fur cap whispers to another, pointing at fresh tracks that vanish into a bramble thicket. Overhead, a horn sounds a low rolling note that drifts down to the village and reminds every hidden ear these woods are not yours. By the great oak, the Lord sits mounted on a tall horse, his breath misting in the dawn chill. He surveys the clearing like a king beneath a canopy of green. His falcon, hooded and calm, perches on his gauntlet, ready to take flight at a gesture. The peasants kneeling at the forest's edge keep their eyes lowered. One stolen glance could mean suspicion, a rumor, a punishment that starts at the stocks and ends much darker. Scholars still puzzle over how many poachers slipped away unnoticed, leaving behind a single bloody feather or a snapped twig. Some say village stews often bubbled with forbidden flesh, secrets swallowed with the broth. But here in this clearing, the message is clear. As the horns echo, the forest belongs to the Lord, and mercy does not hunt alongside him. Leave the hush of the forest behind and step into the cool shadow of stone once more, this time through a small arched doorway leading to the manor's private chapel. In the feudal world, power wore many shapes: iron gates, armored knights, spiral stairs. But none was so quietly potent as the flicker of candlelight on worn stone, where the church's whispered blessings turned mortal men into rulers by the grace of God. You pause at the chapel's heavy door. It creaks on ancient hinges as you slip inside. Incense clings to the air, sweet and sharp, curling around flickering tapers that line the narrow aisle. At the altar stands a priest in coarse robes, his back bent not just from age, but from decades of kneeling to both God and Lord alike. Beside him, a young monk lights candles, eyes flicking now and then to the high window where daylight stains the stone in muted colors. It's a simple fact: the church's power was no mere blessing spoken over bread and wine. It legitimized every oath sworn in the courtyard, every seal pressed into wax, every verdict handed down beneath the manor's banners. Some scholars still argue whether the clergy truly believed in the divine right they preached, or whether their loyalty was greased with favors, coin land the promise of protection when winter famine crept too close. You step closer to a worn pew, fingers brushing the smooth wood, polished by generations of anxious villagers. Here peasants confess sins real or imagined, and priests murmured forgiveness in Latin words few fully understood. A stolen chicken might earn penance paid in extra eggs. A whispered curse about the Lord might be erased with coins slid quietly into a wooden box. Behind the altar, a gilded crucifix catches the wavering candlelight. Its gold leaf peels at the edges, a quiet irony that this battered icon still stands guard, while hungry tenants kneel and beg for mercy their Lord pretends to grant. But only the priest can absolve. Above it, a small stained glass panel shows a knight kneeling at a saint's feet, armor gleaming sword-lowered power, humbled in holy light. Or so the image promises. In the side alcove, you glimpse a ledger half covered by a woolen cloth. Here, the parish records lie hidden births, deaths, marriages arranged to bind rival manors, together with sacred vows. Every page, another knot tightening around the manor's power. If a lord strayed too far, breaking faith, taking what was forbidden, the same priests who crowned him just might murmur to Rome or to a rival bishop and watch his stronghold crack from within. No wonder lords gifted gold cups and acres of fertile land to the church. A priest's blessing could rally knights as quickly as any spear. And if sins grew inconvenient, a whispered absolution might cost no more than a fresh barrel of mead for the chapel's cellar. You step back into the nave's hush, the incense still clinging to your cloak. Beyond these cold walls, the peasants hoe, frozen fields, the knights polish spears, the steward counts eggs. But in this chapel, the Lord kneels, just like any serf, one whispered prayer away from being untouchable again. Slip quietly from the chapel's smoky hush into the manor's grand dining hall once more. Tonight, it's no raucous feast for knights and jesters, but a hushed table where the church and nobility break bread together, bargaining over power beneath a ceiling heavy with candle wax and shadows. This is the part of feudal life that never makes it to village gossip, how the Lord's excess and the bishop's blessing share a single goblet, their secrets salted into steaming platters of meat. A single hearth flickers at one end of the long table. Between pewter plates and carved trenchers, the Lord leans back, his fur collar dusted with crumbs, rings tapping against his cup as he waits for the bishop's next word. The bishop, older shrewd eyes hidden under the droop of his velvet hat, tugs at a roast capon, with fingers more accustomed to parchment than bone. It's a plain fact, no tithe was ever free, no blessing given without strings. The church needed coin as much as the manor needed divine approval, and sometimes the table was where the real treaties were sealed, one fat goose for an overlooked sin, a cask of wine for a discreet look away, when the Lord's private justice overstepped holy law. Some scholars still argue how many peasants starved so the Lord's pantry could bribe forgiveness, and whether the bishop's purse grew heavier than his prayers. You drift closer to the head of the table. A steward hovers in the shadows, refilling cups, just as conversation dips into uneasy territory. Talk of border disputes, of rival lords eager for land, of peasants whispering too freely in alehouses after dark. The bishop wipes grease from his chin, murmurs a half laugh at some offhand joke about excommunication, then lifts his cup in mock blessing over the half-eaten boar's head. At the far end, a boy too young to understand half of what's traded here watches with wide eyes. He passes a bowl of dates between silver plates, careful not to spill sticky syrup on the bishop's sleeve. Later, he'll repeat what scraps he heard to the scullery maid, who will tell the baker's daughter, who will whisper to the miller's son secrets that slip through iron gates like mice through a granary. Near the hearth, a parchment lies folded, half burned by a careless ember, some record of an old tithe, or promise half forgotten and half feared. The Lord's eyes flick to it, then back to the bishop's sly smile. Power here is quieter than knights clashing at dawn. It's ladled out in gravy, traded in nods, sealed with a shared loaf, blessed under the bishop's breath. There's no final toast tonight, just a curt nod, a sign of the cross, drawn lazily in the smoke. The bishop rises robes, sweeping the rushes clean. Tomorrow he'll stand in the chapel's glow and remind the peasants to obey their earthly lord. Tonight he carries a full belly and a heavier purse back through the same iron gate the peasants can only dream of crossing. Slip out of the banquet's hush and wander down a torchlit corridor that hums with secrets metal can't keep. Beneath the grand feasts and whispered blessings lies a truth no lord would ever carve into stone fear. Fear of revolt, fear of betrayal. And so deep within the manor's cold belly, the armory waits a vault of iron promises against the restless souls beyond the gate. The heavy door creaks as you push inside. Rows of chainmail glisten like dull fish scales, swords hang from pegs, their edges oiled and gleaming in the flicker of lanterns. A young squire stoops in the corner, hammering out dents on a battered breastplate proof that a parade ground is not always a safe place for pride. The air smells of rust and old sweat, the soft echo of steel against stone, blending with the steady drip of melting wax. One simple fact: even the wealthiest lords wrapped in priestly blessings and iron gates built private armies just in case fear slipped through a crack. Some historians still argue how many of these militias ever saw real battle, and how often their mere presence kept peasants quiet and neighbors polite. Yet each blade on these racks tells its own story, paid for in taxes of chickens and grain oaths, sworn at dawn, rumors kept in check by the cold promise of steel. You run a hand along the haft of a spear, taller than any peasant's cottage door. Its tip gleams wickedly under the lantern light. In the far corner, rows of crossbows lie stacked like sleeping dogs, their strings taut bolts lined up in neat rows. A steward slips in behind you, muttering to the squire about inventory, how many helmets lost to rust, how many arrowheads missing since last winter's border skirmish. By the far wall, a suit of plate armor stands alone, polished to a dull glow. It once belonged to the Lord's grandfather, who rode out to crush a minor rebellion, 3 valleys over peasants who thought that hunger gave them the right to tear down an iron gate. There's no scholarly consensus on how many died for that folly. The manor's scrolls only note that taxes were paid promptly afterward, and the surviving fields turned up neat rows of rye once more. A draft curls through the armory's shadows, making the spearheads shiver in their racks. You picture a peasant boy peering in through a crack in the wall, seeing the iron stockpile that turns whispered revolt into hushed surrender. Each sword here is a cold oath. Behave, work the fields pay, and chickens gossip if you must, but never test the edge that waits behind the gate. The steward checks off his final tally, his chalk scratching soft marks onto a slate board. A squire hauls another breastplate onto a rack. Somewhere overhead, knights laugh and drink away their anxieties, trusting that these walls and this iron heart will hold when dawn breaks again. And you step back out, the chill of steel clinging to your thoughts like a ghost at your shoulder. Slip through a narrow door at the base of the armory tower, and you'll find yourself back among the people who live just beyond the reach of steel. The villagers who trade their fear for ale and gossip, tucked away in the crooked warmth of a timbered alehouse where secrets ferment as easily as the sour cider behind the bar. Push the warped door open and feel the rush of heat, the tang of spilled drink and wood smoke that clings to every sleeve and cloak. Here words flow faster than coins, and the only armor is a sharp tongue or a well-timed laugh. At a corner table, a knot of farmers hunch over chipped mugs, breath fogging the air as they mutter tales that would never reach the manor's polished halls. One simple fact: the village alehouse was more than a place to numb the ache of bent backs and empty purses. It was the beating heart of rumor, a place where a peasant could call the lord a fool, a knight, a drunkard, the steward, a crooked fox, and somehow live to hoe the fields the next morning. Historians still argue whether lords underestimated the power of alehouse chatter or simply pretended not to hear what drifted up the muddy road at dawn. You slip closer to the hearth, where an old man nurses a mug of warm beer, his breath rattling with every chuckle. He leans in to a wide-eyed boy who hangs on each word tonight's tale, a fresh rumor about the manor's mad heir who hunts ghosts in the orchard by moonlight. The boy laughs too loud. A quick hush passes over the benches. Too much noise invites the wrong ears. They all know the steward's man might be at the next table pretending to doze under his hood. At the bar, a young woman swaps a story for a free cup. She claims the lord's knights quarreled over a spilled jug last dawn, nearly drawing steel over whose boots were muddied first. True or not, the tale will grow in the telling. By next week, the knights will have fought a secret duel, the steward's cousin will have lost an ear, and the lord will be rumored to punish them by sending them to guard pigsties instead of gates. Near the door, a carpenter nods along, folding a fresh rumor into the creases of his mine fuel for the next time a neighbor complains of taxes too steep or chickens too few. No iron gate can keep these whispered rebellions out. By morning, the same men who curse the manor by firelight will bend their backs under the same lord's banner. But tonight, the truth is flexible as warm ale and sharper than any sword. There's no clear consensus among scholars on how much these gossip-slick tales ever fueled real revolt. Maybe they were just safety valves words that eased a burden no iron gate could lift. Maybe once in a while they sparked something bigger. But for now, the fire crackles, mugs clink, and somewhere outside, the cold wind tugs at shutters that rattle like loose secrets waiting to break free. Slip away from the warm fug of the alehouse and wander down the muddy lane that snakes between shuttered cottages. Behind these doors, the gossip spoken over mugs thickens into secrets not fit for daylight tales of hidden bloodlines and half-whispered affairs that could topple a noble's name faster than any siege or sword. Push open a warped wooden gate and step into a dark corner of the manor's history, bastards, and bloodlines. Here the stone walls can't hide what candlelight births behind heavy curtains. A lord's heir is not always born of his wife's bed, and sometimes the quiet child tucked into a far-off cottage wears the same eyes as the man feasting at the high table. It's an unavoidable fact. Inheritances could twist a family tree into knots no priest or steward could straighten. Some scholars still argue how many secret children changed the course of local power. An heir swapped at birth, a bastard son, hidden until the legitimate line withered a mistress's whisper, strong enough to claim land and coin when the old lord's bones settled under cold earth. Near the village edge, an old woman sits by the hearth spinning thread as she hums a tune older than any parchment seal. She knows the story of the knight's son, who was not his son at all, how a shepherd's daughter birthed him after a single summer tryst behind the grain barn. He grew up strong, clever, better with numbers than swords. And when famine came, it was his secret deals that kept the granaries full. No title on parchment, but power nonetheless. Somewhere deeper in the manor, a young noblewoman sits at her chamber window pen, scratching over hidden letters. Her belly swells under silken layers, the father's name a rumor that drifts no further than the midwife's trembling lips. If the Lord finds out, the child might vanish into a distant monastery or appear years later at the feast table as a cousin whose claim no one dares question. You follow a narrow passage behind the great hall, where maids giggle over stories too dangerous to repeat within earshot of the steward. They know who sneaks down which corridor after dusk, who locks which door, who clutches whose wrist in the orchard shadows when the moon sits fat above the battlements. The irony, the same knights who swear loyalty at dawn stand guard over scandals that could unmake their master's house. There's no clear scholarly consensus on how many blood feuds and petty wars were sparked by a bastard's sudden claim, or a wife's secret grief made public. But the manor's stones remember every whispered name, every hush money coin pressed into a steward's palm to keep a secret exactly where it was born. Step back out into the night and feel the cold wind that never cares who fathers whom. The fields will be plowed all the same, the taxes paid in chickens and grain. But behind each sealed gate, a hidden child might yet claim a title, a strip of land, a piece of power waiting for the right whisper to crack the walls wide open. Leave the tangled secrets of hidden heirs behind and follow the flickering torchlight down a corridor lined with cold, damp stone. Here power shifts from flesh and rumor to wax and parchment, where a lord's spoken command becomes law with the press of a heavy seal. And a scrap of vellum can bind a peasant tighter than iron chains ever could. You pause beside a stout oak door, its hinges crusted with centuries of rust. Push it open, and you find a small chamber that smells of tallow and ink. A scribe sits hunched at a low table quill, scratching softly over a fresh sheet. Beside him, a tall iron candle guttering wax onto a stack of sealed scrolls, each stamped with the Lord's signet, an impression no villager would dare to counterfeit. It's a plain fact that for many medieval lords, the seal was mightier than the sword. Some scholars argue that this simple lump of wax pressed with a signet ring's mark carried more weight than 1,000 armored knights when it came to collecting taxes, settling land disputes, or deciding who owned the barley growing 3 fields over. Surviving records show peasants traveled for miles just to glimpse the parchment that decided their fates. Most couldn't read the Latin scratches, but the seal was clear enough: obey or risk ruin. A steward leans over the scribe's shoulder, now pointing with a gloved finger. Another demand for chickens, maybe, or a boundary settled in the Lord's favor before the fields thaw. With a flick of his wrist, the scribe drips a blob of red wax, then presses the heavy iron seal until it cools and hardens a tiny fortress no rumor can breach. On a shelf behind, the scribe sits a wooden box lined with velvet, filled with the Lord's other signets, one for village decrees, one for letters to neighboring lords, one for the bishop's eyes only. Each ring holds a different version of the truth. Each mark turns spoken rumor into stone solid fact. And if the seal is pressed onto false words, well, few peasants have the means or courage to challenge a lord's wax. You drift closer, eyeing a broken seal discarded in the hearth's ashes. Rumor says a villager once dared to tear open a sealed decree, hoping to swap a line, alter a name, trick the steward into forgetting a debt. When the deception was uncovered, the culprit vanished beyond the manor's gate and never returned. His fields seized his cottage, stripped to its rafters for firewood. Historians still debate whether this tale is truth or scarecrow. Its moral is clear either way. A final scroll sits ready on the table wax, cooling in the dim candlelight. Tomorrow, it will ride out beneath a steward's cloak, pass the iron gate, and land in a peasant's trembling hands. One press of a seal, one lord's word made iron. No armor needed, just ink wax and a mark no one dares break. Step out from the quiet scratch of quills and seals and feel the air shift colder, now sharper, as you wander toward the edge of the manor's walled yard, where stone granaries squat like silent sentinels. These thick-walled storehouses are the final line between survival and starvation. Yet the grain inside doesn't belong to those who break their backs, coaxing it from frozen fields. Here, when famine knocks, power shows its harshest face. You stand beside a granary door, its hinges banded in iron, its lock bigger than any peasant's hope of prying it open unseen. The steward stands guard, with a thin ledger tucked under his arm, counting sacks one by one, as men carry them in from carts shrouded in frost. A stray chicken pecks at scattered kernels, risking a quick boot if the steward's mood sours. One fact is plain. Throughout countless harsh winters, peasants learned that empty bellies below manor walls didn't always mean empty storehouses inside. Some scholars still argue whether hoarding was pure survival or quiet cruelty lords stockpiling wheat behind stone, while entire villages scraped soup from bitter roots. The granary was the real castle, its door more powerful than the tallest tower when snow buried the roads and the fields turned to brittle mud. Inside, you see the grain stacked high in canvas sacks, rows upon rows that lean like sleeping soldiers, each one marked with a chalked symbol. How much was paid in taxes? How much tithe claimed by the church? How much will keep the Lord's table full through Lent, while peasants grind bark into their bread? Near a small brazier, an old woman wraps herself in a wool shawl, cupping a mug of thin broth as she watches her son unload another sack. She knows he'll never taste more than a handful of this wheat, unless he dares the secret deals whispered on frozen nights. A stolen scoop here, a swapped sack there, risks that buy another week of warmth in a world where cold eats as hungrily as hunger does. Historians have found contradictory scraps of evidence. Some scrolls note generous lords opening their granaries in dire times. Others record quiet riots when villagers found padlocks where charity should have been. No clear answer, only the same pattern hoarded grain-hungry bellies' prayers muttered at chapel doors that the Lord's heart might thaw before spring's thaw arrives. A crow caws from the granary's roof, pecking at a loose thatch edge. Below, the steward snaps the ledger shut and turns the key in the heavy door. The click echoes across the yard like a final verdict: survive, if you can beg if you must. But remember who holds the key when the fields lie dead under snow. And as you step back, the cold wind cuts through your cloak. The granary stands quiet stone, and iron humming with the knowledge that behind every warm hearth in the manor, 100 cold hearths shiver beyond its gate. Slip away from the granary's heavy silence and follow the worn flagstones to a smaller yard tucked behind the manor's main hall, a place that smells of churned earth, old straw, and the sharp tang of fear. Here the Lord's private court gathers in the open air, where justice or vengeance, depending on who you ask, plays out before the same trembling eyes that sow the fields and fill the granaries. A rough wooden platform stands at the center, flanked by 2 stone pillars streaked with moss. On the platform, a single block sits cold and waiting a reminder that not all disobedience earns only a fine. Peasants press together along the fence line, breath misting in the brittle air, heads bowed more from caution than piety. The steward stands to one side, unrolling a parchment that cracks in the chill like a whip. One plain fact in the Lord's world rebellion needn't mean pitchforks and torches. Sometimes it's no more than a broken fence, a refusal to yield up a chicken, a whispered promise that the taxes won't be paid this year. Historians still argue whether these small defiance flickers were brave or foolish. One spark can light a bonfire or flicker out under a boot heel. A young man stands alone before the platform now. His tunic, his thin knees, stained with mud. He's no hardened rebel, just a tenant farmer who spoke out when the steward demanded more than his share of barley. A soft murmur ripples through the crowd as the Lord's voice cuts the cold air. He doesn't shout. He doesn't need to. His words are measured, each pause, reminding everyone here who stands with power and who kneels before it. A choice is given: exile or execution. A grim fork in the road that many peasants fear more than famine. Exile means no land, no hearth, no protection on roads where bandits thrive and wolves follow your scent for days. Execution, though swift, final. The manor's iron gate, forever shut behind your spilled blood. Both serve the same lesson for those watching. The young man's mother stifles a cry behind a calloused hand. A boy, his brother perhaps, clutches her skirts, eyes wide, mouth open in wordless dread. The steward leans in to whisper something to the Lord. A nod, a flick of the gloved hand. The young man is led away barefoot on frozen stones that show him mercy no more than the Lord ever did. Scholars still debate how often such sentences truly deterred rebellion. For every peasant silenced by fear, another might slip into the forest, find shelter with outlaws, wait for night to fall, before slipping back with a torch to test just how untouchable the manor's gates really are. As the crowd drifts back to fields and hearths, whispers fly faster than the steward can stamp them out. The block stands cold and empty again for now, and somewhere in the hush of straw and hoofbeats, you feel it. Power enforced by steel might last a season, but fear enforced by exile or execution lingers for generations. Leave behind the rough platform and its whispered warnings and drift deeper into the manor's quieter corridors, places where the Lord's power moves unseen, carried not by steel or parchment, but by the silent steps of the steward. You might think a feudal lord held his realm together by force alone, but listen closely, and you'll hear the softer footsteps that truly bind the village to the manor gate. Slip through a narrow door beside the main hall, and you'll find him there, the steward, bent over a battered ledger by candlelight. The wax drips steadily while his quill scratches out debts fines and the faint trails of coin that pass from peasant hands to manor coffers. His cloak is plain wool, but the weight it carries is heavier than a knight's chainmail. He is the one who makes sure taxes are gathered, punishments, enforced secrets buried beneath polite nods and heavy locks. It's a plain fact many lords spent more time hunting deer or feasting under banners than tending to the dull grind of daily rule. Some scholars argue the steward was the true ruler, his quiet word deciding which tenant kept a cow, which woman's rumor reached the Lord's ear, whose missing chicken might earn a knock at the door after dusk. Surviving records show stewards who vanished entire debts for a bribe, or who tightened the noose when a peasant dared speak out. You stand near the edge of his table, watching him seal a note with a blob of wax. A boy appears in the shadows, barefoot eyes wary. The steward barely glances up as he hands the boy the folded scrap. A message for the miller, perhaps, or a threat for the tenant who's late on barley. The boy vanishes into the corridor silent as an owl in the rafters. A soft knock at the steward's door. Two farmers shuffled in hats, in hand cheeks flushed from cold and nerves. They bow low, stammer apologies, promise that the next flock of hens will be fatter than the last. The steward listens, face calm as parchment, before dismissing them with a flick of his fingers. No raised voice, no drawn sword, yet they bow deeper than they ever would to the armored knight patrolling the yard. Outside, a passing servant whispers to a maid about the steward's ledgers, how they swell in winter when food is scarce and fear fattens faster than any pig. Some say the steward keeps two books, one for the Lord's eyes, another for his own purse. Historians still argue whether such tales are folklore or simple truth dressed in village gossip. Either way, the steward's soft footsteps echo through every exchange of coin, every whispered promise of mercy. By dusk, his candle gutters low. The ledger closes with a thud that sounds like a barred door to anyone hoping to plead for leniency tomorrow. Beyond the manor's walls, the peasants settle by their fires, knowing that no armored knight will come for their chickens tonight. But the steward's shadow might knock before the rooster crows. And that more than iron gates or sealed scrolls keeps the manor's power tight around every throat that works its fields. Leave the steward's flickering candle behind and drift up the narrow back stairs where secrets wear silk instead of iron. Here in the hush of shuttered chambers, power sometimes sits not on a lord's shoulders, but in the glint of a wife's dagger, tucked discreetly beneath brocade when words fail and whispers won't do. Push open a carved oak door. The air inside is warm, with the scent of dried lavender and smoldering tallow. A noble woman sits at a small writing table, her hair-pinned high silver comb catching the candlelight as she dips her quill. Outside this chamber, she is the lady of the manor, smiling politely beside her husband at feasts, whispering prayers in the chapel's first pew. But within these walls, where the steward's ledger can't reach, and knights dare not intrude, rumor says she rules with a sharper edge. It's a plain fact. When lords rode to distant skirmishes or fell drunk in the hall, their wives often governed in their stead. Some scholars argue these women wielded more real power than the armored men they sent out to defend the manor's borders. Surviving letters speak of land sales negotiated by candlelight rival heirs, married off to settle debts, secret alliances brokered with a smile, and sealed with a discreet threat. By her elbow rests a slender dagger, its hilt set with dull gems, the blade clean, but for a faint nick near the tip, a quiet promise that not every slight stays unanswered. In the village alehouse, the peasants whisper about the lord's lady, who once slipped poppy syrup into a rival's cup. Another rumor says she had the steward's predecessor exiled for skimming too much grain. No record proves it, only the hush that settles when her name drifts through the cold. Behind her, a maid moves about the chamber, poking at the fire, pretending not to hear the noblewoman's murmured words. On the table, 2 letters lie open, one from a neighboring manor, offering marriage for her daughter to secure a patch of forest rich with game. The other, a half-burned threat from a lesser cousin who demands coin in exchange for silence over secrets best kept behind these thick walls. She picks up the dagger, turning it slowly in her palm. No knight's oath binds her, only the iron will to protect what's hers when her husband's armor is miles away. Some historians still argue whether these tales of poison and hidden blades are half fantasy spun by fearful peasants, but whether they're truth or fable, the manor's stones have seen enough hushed meetings, enough sickbed deaths, to make the rumors feel real enough by candlelight. She sets the dagger down, at last, folds the letters, and seals them in wax, with her ring, her own seal, not her husband's. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, while the Lord snores blissfully, below, unaware or willfully blind to the fact that his untouchable name might rest more on his wife's hidden hand than on any iron gate. Step away from the hush of silk and steel and wander out into the muddy village square, where for a few short days each year, the tension between lord and peasant softens, at least on the surface. Here, beneath fluttering banners and the thump of drum and fiddle, you find the harvest festival, a riot of laughter, bread-spilled cider, and a subtle reminder of exactly who holds the purse strings when the dancing ends. You stand among a throng of villagers packed shoulder to shoulder near a makeshift stage. Bright scraps of cloth flap from wooden poles, children chase each other through the straw-scattered mud, and the scent of roasting meat drifts from a spit turned by a red-faced cook whose apron is smeared with fat and ashes. Laughter rises over the hum of fiddles, but beneath it, something else flickers, gratitude edged with wary glances at the steward standing watch near the ale barrels. One plain fact: feasts and festivals were never just charity. They were carefully staged theater public gestures of the Lord's generosity. He opens his granary for a day, fattens the village belly with stew and ale, and for that brief time, every grumble about taxes fades behind the clink of mugs. Some scholars still argue whether these festivals bought true loyalty or simply dulled rebellion long enough for winter's hunger to creep back in. Near the center of it all, the Lord sits perched on a raised wooden seat, his fur cloak thrown wide despite the crisp air. He lifts a cup whenever a mug is thrust his way, nods magnanimously as villagers bow too low to spill cider on his boots. Behind him, the steward keeps careful watch that no one drinks more than their portion. Generosity has limits, even when dressed in garlands and bright ribbons. You drift past a group of young men wrestling over a sack of apples, laughing so loud they miss the old woman slipping an extra roll into her apron pocket for a child waiting by the edge of the square. Small rebellions hide inside big feasts, tiny acts of taking back what's been measured out crumb by crumb all year. Closer to the stage, a handful of peasants stomp out a dance on splintered boards. A fiddler saws his bow across the strings, his eyes darting from the Lord's table to the dancing feet. If the Lord claps, he plays faster. If the Lord frowns, he shifts the tune to a softer reel. Between steps, whispered gossip skips from mouth to mouth. How much grain still sits behind the manor gates, who paid in chickens, but got none of this year's stew. Historians love to puzzle over these festivals. Were they acts of genuine goodwill or clever tools of control? No record offers a clear answer, but one thing's certain: when the last fire burns low, when the music sighs into silence, the iron gate swings shut again. The stew pot empties, the barrels dry up, and the same fields wait at dawn for bent backs and blistered hands. Tonight, though, the villagers dance in the mud, warm and full. For once, beneath banners that flap like soft promises that tomorrow's hunger might be kept away, at least until the fiddler's bow falls silent. Step away from the flickering lanterns and dying bonfires of the harvest square, and drift down a crooked path where shadows gather behind the manor's walls. Not all debts here are paid in chickens or grain. Some fade away with the rustle of coins exchanged in secret corners, a quiet pardon for sale to those who know whose palm to grease when the law grows inconvenient. Slip through the servants' gate behind the great hall where barrels of wine lean stacked against damp stone. Here, a man waits cloak, pulled tight eyes darting like a rat sniffing for crumbs, The steward appears ledger, tucked under one arm, the faintest smile flickering across lips that never move when the Lord is near. They stand close words swallowed by the wind that rattles empty casks. One fact stands clear as any seal in the feudal world: justice was flexible if you could pay the toll. Some scholars still debate how many villagers bought their freedom from stocks or gallows with a bag of silver or a pair of fat geese. Surviving scrolls hint at bribes hidden inside tithes, hush money tucked inside holy offerings, a pouch slipped beneath a steward's cloak to ensure a brother's name vanished from a parchment before dawn. Near the courtyard, a young girl peeks out from behind the old stones, listening as the two men speak in low voices. Her father, a poacher caught with a brace of forbidden rabbits, sits shivering in a shed nearby, waiting to hear whether he will see the next dawn or the inside of an exile's cold path. If enough coin crosses hands tonight, his crime might fade into the shadows like so many before him. You wander closer. The steward opens his ledger, but doesn't bother to write. This is a debt that won't stain parchment. Instead, he weighs the coin purse in one palm, nods, once slips it under his cloak, where no knight's blade will find it. The man bows low. Thanks, muttered, with the desperation of a man who knows he's buying more than freedom. He's buying silence, a second chance, a secret no gossiping villager can wield against him later. Historians argue over how widespread this justice for sale truly was. Some claim it was the manor's worst-kept secret, woven so deep into village life that peasants half expected it saving hens and silver coins for the day trouble arrived. Others swear it was a rare betrayal of feudal honor. But the stones underfoot remember how many boots shuffled here in the hush before dawn, how many secrets traded for the price of a few warm coins. Above it all, the manor's high window glows with candlelight. Maybe the Lord knows. Maybe he looks away, trusting that every debt settled this way binds his people tighter than iron chains ever could. The steward shuts his ledger with a soft thud, coins hidden beneath fur and wool. A whispered crime erased before dawn, paid for in clinking silver that never echoes in the Lord's official records. And the gate creaks closed behind you once more, sealing away a truth that will never see parchment. Slip from the hush of secret coins back into the raw chill of open fields. This time, the manor's iron gate feels even heavier behind you. The peasants bow lower, the steward's ledger swells. But when plague comes crawling over these muddy roads, even the thickest stone walls can't seal away the fear that drips into every crack and hearth. You stand near the village's edge, where huts huddle together like shivering sheep. A cough rattles through the damp dusk air, followed by the soft thud of a door slammed shut. Smoke trickles from low chimneys, carrying with it the sharp bite of burning herbs, half medicine, half desperate prayer. In the fields beyond the rows lie ragged and untended, where strong hands once swung hoes and plows, now fallen still behind barred shutters. One fact remains unchanged through centuries. Plague did not care for wax seals or noble bloodlines. Some historians still argue whether feudal lords truly hid behind their high walls, abandoning the sick beyond the gate, or if that's just how frightened villagers remembered it later. But the records show manor gates drawn tight when fever came knocking. Desperate guards posted not to keep enemies out, but to keep sickness from creeping in. You walk the muddy path past the tiny chapel, where a lone priest kneels at the stone doorstep, chanting prayers that drift through the night air like thin smoke. His robe hangs loose on shoulders bent from burying neighbors he once blessed at birth. Nearby, a single bell tolls slow, hesitant, as if each note must push its way through fear thick as winter fog. Inside, the manor candles flicker behind shuttered windows. A serving girl wipes down banisters with bitter herbs, her sleeves tied tight around trembling arms. Knights, who once rode boldly at dawn, now pace the courtyard edge, swords sheathed, but eyes sharp for any sign of sick peasants pushing against the gate, hoping for medicine or mercy that won't come. Near the old orchard wall, a mother huddles with two children, wrapped in patched blankets. She presses a damp cloth to her youngest's brow, while her eyes flick up at the tower's high window, where the Lord's flickering candle mocks her in its warmth. Rumor says the manor's kitchen is stocked well enough to feed the household for months. The granary's locked tighter than ever, while the village scratches at roots and brambles for broth. Scholars debate whether fear or survival shaped these walls when plague struck. Some say the lords retreated out of cowardice. Others argue they locked themselves away to protect the grain, the knights, the seal, everything that made them untouchable in the first place. The truth is likely both self-preservation, wrapped in prayers and guarded with iron bolts. And as the bell tolls one last time, the wind carries the sound over the locked gate over fields, now silent except for the coughs that echo beneath thatched roofs, each one a reminder that when sickness comes, even the highest stone keeps its secrets by staying cold and quiet. Step away from the hush of plague-burdened fields and into the memory of something rarer, those nights when the untouchable was touched, when peasants who had bowed and scraped for generations rose up pitchforks in hand and dared to set fire to the manor's lie of safety. This is the peasants' revolt, a spark that flickered more than once across feudal Europe, where the heavy gates did not always hold. Stand at the edge of the village square under a dark sky split by shouts instead of festival drums. You hear the clatter of boots, not armored knights this time, but rag-wrapped feet stomping mud into angry paths. Torches bob like angry stars lighting faces normally hidden beneath wool hoods. Fear has cracked under hunger taxes, plague pushed too far, bent too low. The peasants remember that stone walls crumble when enough hands tear at them. One solid fact revolts, were the nightmare woven into every iron hinge and sealed scroll. Some historians still argue whether they were inevitable explosions of misery or carefully stirred uprisings sparked by cunning whispers over alehouse mugs. Surviving records tell of entire villages lighting their own fields so the Lord could not tax a harvest that never ripened of stewards dragged from ledgers into muddy streets to answer for every stolen chicken and grain sack. You move through the chaos now, slipping past a boy no older than 12 who grips a blackened pitchfork taller than himself. His father stands beside him, face wrapped in a rag against the smoke curling from burning carts piled near the manor wall. A dog darts past, with a stolen haunch of meat tripping over discarded tools turned weapons. At the main gate, the old iron hinges groan under the battering of makeshift ram's logs stripped of bark, hoisted by hands, calloused from pulling plows now pounding at the same timber that once kept them hungry and silent. Inside, the steward shouts orders to terrified servants. Knights scramble to buckle armor they haven't needed in seasons too soft with bribes and fear. In a corner of the courtyard, a banner falls into the flames, a faded crest that once promised protection, now curling to ash. Some say a revolt never lasts. Some say it never really ends. Historians debate whether these bursts of rage brought real change or just swapped one master for another. But in this breathless moment, as sparks drift upward into the black sky, you see what the manor fears most people who forget to bow. A scream echoes from the orchard, maybe a guard cornered, maybe a rebel caught, where stone still holds its secrets tight. Somewhere deeper in the manor, the Lord's candle still burns guttering as boots stomp closer. Tonight, the Untouchable trembles. Tomorrow, perhaps the iron gates will swing wide for good, or maybe they'll be rebuilt stronger than before. But in this moment, pitchforks rattle against shields, voices roar through smoke, and the cold hush that once wrapped every cottage in quiet fear is split wide open just long enough for a torch's flame to flicker at the foot of a crumbling wall, slip through the charred remains of that once iron gate, and walk among timbers that groan under creeping vines. This is what waits when revolt's fire fades, when the pitchforks are dropped, the knights buried or bought, and the manor no longer hums with sealed scrolls or whispered bribes. This is the fall of a manor, slow, silent, inevitable, as weeds, prying stone, apart one root at a time. You stand in what was once a courtyard mud, now thick with nettles and moss creeping up broken flagstones. A rusted plow leans forgotten against a cracked wall. Bird's nest, where once the steward kept his ledgers, locked away from curious eyes. There is no steward now, no watchful steward's shadow slipping door to door, no steward's ledger to count chickens never delivered. One plain fact, many manors fell, not with a roar of revolt, but with a sigh, a slow drain of power, from lord to crown, from crown to city. Some scholars still argue whether changing trade routes, rising kings, or restless tenants did more damage than any torch. Surviving records show abandoned granaries, picked clean, once proud banners, rotted to scraps, stuffed in barn eaves by peasants who stayed behind when the manor's last lord fled to court for favor he'd never win. You push through a splintered door into what was once the great hall. The hearth is cold, choked with birds' nests and scattered straw. A broken goblet lies beneath a rotted table, where 100 feasts once reminded the village who owned every roast and loaf. Now ivy climbs the stones, where knights used to lean their spears after dawn drills. No trumpets echo here. No seal waits to press warm wax onto trembling parchment. Near the shuttered window, a battered chest sits half-open scraps of fabric poking out like a mouth too tired to shut. A child's wooden toy peeks from beneath a pile of mildewed furs, evidence that life lingered even as the manor's hold loosened. Some say the final tenants locked the gates one last time and left with carts rattling toward towns where kings' courts traded paper laws for gold coin laws that made lords less necessary with each passing harvest. Outside, the orchard has gone wild, branches twisting around sagging fences meant to keep peasants out, but now only trap brambles. A single goat picks its way through the grass, bleeding at the wind that sighs through broken shutters. The gate stands crooked hinges rusted where so many boots once pounded in fear or fealty. Historians still debate whether these empty manors haunt the countryside like broken teeth in the jaw of old power. Some see tragedy stones that once sheltered families, now nests for crows. Others see freedom fields untied from seals, woods open to any poacher bold enough to snare a rabbit. And as you stand beneath the crumbling arch, you feel it, the hush that comes when power's breath leaves a place replaced by roots and rain and stories traded over fences by peasants who no longer bow when the wind rattles an iron gate that no one bothers to lock. Step beyond the crumbled orchard wall one last time and stand at the edge where old stones give way to meadows and winding roads. Here, the manor's legacy drifts into the present like mist over fields that no longer bow to a single iron gate. This is the legacy of lords, how power once sealed behind cold walls now lingers in names, titles, and museum plaques few villagers glance at twice. You walk along a hedge that used to mark the manor's border, its thorny tangle hides, broken fence posts, splintered and moss-crowned. Beyond it, rows of barley bend in the breeze, tended by hands that owe no taxes and chickens, no whispered bribes, no midnight fear of a steward's knock. Yet listen closely, and you'll hear it, a faint echo of boots in mud, the hush of villagers silencing gossip when the wrong shadow fell across a candle-lit doorway. One undeniable fact: the Lord's power did not vanish. It scattered. Some scholars argue the titles slipped into polite society's back pocket, traded for city influence and neat country estates with no armored knights to defend them. Surviving letters show lords reinventing themselves as landlords, parliament men titled relics, whose ancestors once sealed fates with wax and iron. Now, their power drips through legal loopholes, whispered old money behind new glass towers. You pass a stone plaque, half sunk in the meadow grass. It marks where the manor gate once swung wide to swallow taxes paid in eggs and terrified whispers. Now tourists stand beneath the archway each summer, squinting at a plaque that declares, "This gate once guarded the lands of Lord such and such, defender of this and that." They snap photos, buy stale postcards in the gift shop, then wander back to warm cars idling by the hedge. Inside, what's left of the main hall, sunlight spills across polished display cases, where fragments of wax seals a knight's dented helm. A steward's cracked ledger rests behind glass. A tour guide mutters stories to restless children, tales of feasts and famine of gates meant to keep fear in as much as to keep enemies out. Few listen long enough to catch the old irony, how power once so fierce became quaint, softly sold in tickets and trinkets. Outside the manor grounds, a new village hums with modern life. A boy rides his bike along the old hedge line, trailing laughter instead of whispered gossip. A farmer fixes a fence free to sell his barley, where he likes no steward's shadow to weigh every bushel. And yet, for all the freedom, the stories cling faint echoes of bastards and bloodlines of pardons for sale, of cold stone promises pressed into wax. Historians still debate whether the feudal lord's power ever truly died, or simply learned to wear softer cloaks to trade steel for contracts, iron gates for locked accounts. Maybe the gate never really closed. It only drifted open so wide no one notices when they pass through. So you stand a moment longer where the hedge meets the old stones, listening for boots that no longer march at dawn, for seals that no longer crack warm wax in secret chambers. Only the wind answers now rustling barley, grown for markets that don't care who once called this land untouchable. Rest here a while where the iron gates have rusted back into earth, where the hearth fires have burned down to soft ash, and the heavy seals lie locked behind glass. Let the echoes fade, a hush of knights' boots, the scratch of quills, the low chant of priests who bless secrets hidden in blood and parchment. Imagine the moss climbing over stone, gentle as sleep, pulling at your breath. The manor's hush is no longer fear. It's the soft quiet of fields that feed who they choose, of walls that crumble, so wildflowers can bloom where swords once gleamed. Drift through these overgrown paths in your mind, past the granary doors that will never shut again, past the orchard, tangled and free, past the cold block where whispers once weighed heavier than truth. Close your eyes and let the hush carry you further into meadows untied from taxes, into stories that slip gently from your thoughts as you drift. No more gates to guard, no more footsteps echoing after curfew. just the steady hush of your own breath, the quiet comfort that even the hardest walls soften in time. If you ever wish to return to wander ruined halls or listen for forgotten footsteps, you know the path. But for now, let these stones crumble softly in your dreams.